Thank you very much. Now, what about the Labour Party? What does the public think of the Labour Party?
So I think the overall theme, I'll be sort of slightly more positive about the Labour Party than we were about the Conservative Party. I mean, look, we're as Labour Party candidates, we're told probably like 10, 15 times a week about the importance of not being complacent about the next election. And obviously there's really good reason for that. You know, we're standing in the room where the shallow budget was given. We have seen elections time and time again where it looks like Labour is on a journey to victory only for that to be snatched away right at the last moment. Even as a pollster, I would acknowledge that polls have been wrong in the past and we can't be entirely confident. In fact, actually, I would go even further than that. I would say I'm more worried about the polls. Certainly much more worried about the polls this election than I was going into the last election for various reasons. There's reasons the polls that can be wrong. I think there is an expectation that the polls are going to swing back to the government in the coming months. The question really is how much they're going to swing back. So look, I'm positive. There's certainly been far worse times in recent years to be a Labour Party candidate, and knocking doors in Milton Keynes at the moment is a lot better and more positive than it would have been knocking doors in 2017 or 2019 or even 2015. So that's me sort of, covering the line. But having said all that, I also think it's pretty important to acknowledge just how far Labour has come. I was in a minority of like a handful of people a few years ago in rooms like this going, no, I don't think we should rule out the possibility of Labour coming back in one term. And when I said it, I got, people sort of tilted their heads slightly to the side and were like, really? Do you really mean that? But the reason for that, and part of it's covered in this report, is that voters are far more volatile than they ever have been in history. So you've got more sort of compare the market voters and less party loyalists, and all of the data and the British election study has been showing that and backing that up. Now, yes, that means that we could see a swing back to the Conservatives in coming months. Actually, it could, there's reason to believe that it could be larger than the normal swing back for that reason. But also it means that Labour can go from that historic defeat that we saw in 2019 to a victory in one term if it does everything right and solves the problems that voters had with it at the last election. We sat down coming out of the last election and we looked at what the path would be to Labour turning that around in one term. And yes, obviously it involves holding on to that coalition of progressive voters that Labour won at the last election. But most importantly, Labour needed to win a significant chunk of voters straight off the Conservatives. If you take the pessimistic assumptions that Labour isn't going to get a swing back in Scotland, I'm not necessarily sure that that's true, but there isn't going to be a big turnout change, as in Conservatives are going to stay at home and Labour voters, people who are Labour leaning, are more likely to come out. It's a pessimistic assumption. I don't think it's true, but let's assume it for a minute. And if you don't assume that the Conservatives are going to lose voters to their right, if you take those three assumptions, Labour needs to win 18% of those who voted from the Conservatives, get them directly to switch over to the Labour Party in order to win a comfortable majority at the next election, without those assumptions being held in place. Now, when we first came up with that number and worked that out, that's higher than the numbers we were seeing in 1997. And yet, many of the polls are now showing that kind of switching taking place. Not all of them, but many of them are showing that kind of switching taking place, in which case it's a case of Labour now holding on to those switchers that have moved over. The other thing that I think is important about what we noticed is that there was this particular cohort of Conservative voters. So, you don't go after every Conservative voter. Most Conservative voters, 2/3 of Conservative voters say that they would, rather walk over hot coals than vote for the Labour Party. But there was about 1/3 of voters. They were generally, much more socially conservative than people who normally sit in Labour's voter coalition. But crucially, they were at the economically insecure end of the Conservative coalition. So quite often we talk about socially conservative, economically left-wing value voters. But actually what we were noticing in terms of those voters that we thought might switch and now actually are switching is, yes, they're socially conservative, but crucially they're much more economically insecure. And Jane's piece in this about economic insecurity and how important that is as a switcher, as a driver of switching, is really important. Noticed this a few years ago, and I think broadly Labour has just had that group of voters in their mind constantly, day in, day out, speaking to them, polling them, focus grouping them, and making sure that they're listening to their concerns, putting forward the kind of ideas that will appeal to them in everything that they put forward. That's the reason we've started to see that switching. That's the reason there is that positivity, there is that big, comfortable lead for the Labour Party in the polls at the moment. Now, we've seen it fall away in the past. We might see it fall away again. We need to keep working to make sure that we, as a party, are in the service of working people again. And be honest about the fact that in recent elections we haven't been doing that as well as we should have been.
And what about what Rachel was talking about, low trust, general cynicism? Is that what your experience on the doorstep about the Labour Party as well?
No, I think more than we've seen in recent cycles, people are open to listening to the Labour Party. I think it's certainly true that people are not paying as much attention to politics as everyone in this room is paying attention to politics. People are possibly even paying less attention to politics than they may have been in recent cycles. I think that's certainly true. But then, to be honest, there's a certain amount that is always the case. And that is why I think it's important that, the things that you talk about the Conservative problem about sort of jumping between strategies, and I think that's true. It's important that you shrink down the number of things that you say, and you say them more often. You have a more succinct, more consistent message that you put forward to voters, purely because I don't think part of it's a lack of trust thing, but part of it is that people just have really busy lives. They don't have time to listen to what Keir Starmer's saying day in, day out. The Resolution Foundation event yesterday was brilliant. Most people would not have heard a word that Keir Starmer said. So we have to make sure that we're putting forward a succinct, consistent message that appeals to those crucial voters that Labour needs at the next election.
I want to come on.